Just imagine, you send your child to a well-known summer camp, never suspecting you'll never see them again. They had just arrived at camp. They were 8, 9, and 10 years old. That night, someone approached their tent. One grown man against 3 little girls left all alone. By morning, they were gone. Footprints led deep into the woods. This isn't a legend. This isn't a ghost story. It's a real crime that shocked the entire nation. And after more than 40 years, no one has ever been held responsible. In the summer of 1977, 3 excited Girl Scouts looked forward to a 2-week camping trip, unaware of the unsettling events that had been taking place at Camp Scott for several months. After a sinister encounter, none of the girls ever made it home. Nearly 50 years later, in 2025, this chilling case remains unsolved and continues to haunt those seeking justice. Stay with us, and by the end of this video, you'll discover the secret this story holds. In June 1977, a Girl Scout troop from Oklahoma journeyed to Camp Scott, a secluded and overgrown campsite near the small town of Locust Grove, northeast of Tulsa. For nearly half a century, Girl Scouts had maintained the camp, and it was a cherished tradition for the girls to spend 2 weeks there every year. Spanning over 400 acres, Camp Scott featured a creek where campers could swim, paddle, or canoe during the warm months. The majority of the campground was covered in dense native forest, with the main camping areas nestled in small clearings. Surrounded by wilderness, many campers described Camp Scott as a peaceful refuge, far removed from the outside world. Although the 1977 summer camp was met with excitement, 10-year-old Doris Milner felt uneasy as the departure day approached. 2 of her closest friends had opted out of the trip, leaving Doris anxious about feeling isolated and missing home. For a child her age, spending 2 full weeks away could seem endless, especially without familiar faces beside her on the long bus ride. Her mother tried to reassure her, promising that if homesickness overwhelmed her, she'd come and bring her back home. Michele Hoffman had dreams of becoming a camp counselor. She had visited Camp Scott many times. It practically felt like a second home, yet she never forgot how nervous she had been during her very first trip there at age 9. Now the camp was a familiar place, and Michele felt ready to help younger Girl Scouts feel welcome. When she arrived at the Girl Scout headquarters in Tulsa on June 12, 1977, she immediately noticed Doris Milner. The unease on the girl's face stood out among the other enthusiastic campers. Wanting to help, Michele approached Doris and kindly invited her to sit together on the bus ride to camp. Doris accepted, and as the girls formed a line to board the bus, she stayed close behind Michele. During the ride, Doris began to relax and even joined in as the others started singing traditional camp songs. The campgrounds were divided into separate areas known as units, each one named after a Native American tribe. Every unit contained a designated tent for the counselors, along with space for up to 10 tents to accommodate the young campers. These tents weren't your average camping gear. They were specially designed for Girl Scout outings, offering better protection from weather. Raised on wooden platforms and enclosed with canvas walls on all 4 sides, the tents provided a more stable and secure shelter. Each tent could house 4 campers who slept on simple wooden cots. Campers entered and exited by unzipping and rolling up any of the canvas walls. Each Girl Scout had been assigned to a specific tent for the duration of the trip. Doris Milner was placed with just 2 other girls, Michele Guse, who was 9, and Lori Farmer, the youngest of all the campers at just 8 years old. Originally, a 4th girl, Kristen Chenoweth, was also supposed to share the tent with them, but she fell ill and couldn't make the trip. As evening settled in, Doris sat inside Tent 8 alongside Michele and Lori, feeling far more at ease than she had earlier that day. Their tents had been set up just in time to shield them from the intensifying rain, which was now growing into a full-blown thunderstorm. The tents for the girls had been arranged in a loose semicircle, positioned so the counselors could keep an eye on everyone. However, Tent 8, the one Doris was in, was the furthest from the counselors' location. Its placement also made it harder to see, as it was partially obscured by the nearby shower facilities. As the girls were getting ready to sleep, several counselors made rounds to check on the campers. Michele Hoffman was among them, specifically wanting to ensure that Doris was doing well. When she peeked inside tent 8, she saw that all 3 girls had already drifted off, exhausted from the day's activities. Feeling reassured that Doris was settling in and had found companionship, Michele headed back to her tent and went to bed. What none of the young Girl Scouts knew, however, was that Camp Scott had recently experienced a string of strange and unsettling events that left counselors feeling uneasy. Several staff members had heard eerie, unrecognizable sounds coming from the forest, noises unlike anything made by known animals. In one instance, a male counselor returned to find his tent had been slashed open by what appeared to be a sharp blade. Some campers also complained that their food and belongings had mysteriously disappeared from their tents. Most of the strange occurrences were easily attributed to wild animals and the natural fear that comes from being alone in the woods after dark. There had been reports of a peculiar man spotted nearby, but since he behaved politely and didn't seem suspicious, the camp staff chose not to report him. Just 4 days before the Girl Scout camp started, the camp director, Richard Day, encountered a tall man about 4 miles from the campsite. Richard couldn't recall many details about the man, only that he was notably taller than average. The man asked Richard for directions to the nearest creek to fill a bucket with water, which Richard provided before the man continued on his way. However, one event disturbed Camp Scott more than any other. During a cadet training weekend, an older camper returned to their tent only to find their bags ransacked and all the food missing. In place of the food, someone had left a note inside an empty box of donuts, made up of several torn pages from a small notebook. The first 3 pages were covered repeatedly with the word kill. The last page contained a chilling message: "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in tent 1. Michele was present when this happened and quickly took the notes to show the camp director. Although it was clear that a person was responsible for this, the director dismissed it as a tasteless prank after several campers admitted to writing the notes. After a restless night, the campers were awakened by strange noises coming from the woods. At around 1:30 a.m., camp counselor Carla Wilhite was jolted awake by a loud groaning sound nearby. This wasn't the first time Carla had been disturbed by eerie noises. Just weeks earlier, while sleeping in the staff house at Camp Scott, she had been startled awake by a noise right outside her door. When she opened it, no one was there. Assuming it was another counselor wandering outside, she went back to bed. But as she was about to fall asleep again, the camp dog Sally began growling and barking fiercely. Carla was frightened by Sally's reaction because the dog never growled at campers or staff. Such behavior was usually triggered only by wild animals or strangers lurking nearby. Eventually, Sally calmed down, and Carla managed to return to sleep. Just like the previous time she heard strange sounds at Camp Scott, Carla got up to investigate shortly after 1:30 a.m. on June 13th. She stepped out of her tent and searched around the campsite for the source of the noise, but found nothing unusual. Several of the younger Girl Scouts had also heard the sounds but soon fell back asleep. Ultimately, Carla returned to her tent, convinced that the noises were likely caused by a wildcat or a hungry bear. Just half an hour later, another camper was awakened by the sound of someone unzipping the tent flaps. She noticed a person outside waving a flashlight. A few of the girls spotted a man roaming near the tents, but when they shone their flashlight at him, he simply walked away. His face remained unseen, and he ignored the girls entirely. Although puzzled, the girls were not frightened and soon fell back asleep. About an hour later, another camper was awakened by screams. Although it was difficult to discern in the darkness and she didn't leave her tent to investigate, the cries appeared to come from the edge of the campsite, near tent 8. A third camper also heard the screams, along with a young girl's distressed voice repeatedly calling, "Mama, Mama, Mama." None of the counselors heard the noises. Since the campers were young and alone in the dark, they didn't know how to react, assuming that perhaps one of the girls was having a nightmare or feeling homesick. Eventually, the screaming ceased and the campers fell back asleep. The following morning, around 6 a.m., Carla went to the shower area. As she glanced past the showers, she noticed something unusual: a sleeping bag outside a tent with a figure lying motionless on top of it. It quickly became clear to Carla that the young girl was no longer alive. Covered in blood from a brutal beating, she was barely recognizable. Carla had just found the body of Doris Milner, the 10-year-old girl who had been hesitant to join the camping trip from the start. In a state of confusion and growing fear, Carla, still groggy from sleep, ran to find help. She quickly located the camp nurse and one of the directors, urging them to come with her right away. Carla later said that the true gravity of the situation didn't fully register until she returned to where the body was. At first, the nurse thought Carla was simply overreacting and assumed one of the girls might have gotten hurt. But upon seeing Doris's body, she instantly understood that Carla's alarm had been very real. Carla and the rest of the counselors began checking the tents and quickly found that one of them was completely abandoned, its interior stained with blood. One of the girls who had been assigned to Tent 8 was already confirmed dead. Her body had been placed in a sleeping bag and left near the woods. The other 2 campers and their bedding were missing. However, within just a few minutes of searching, the counselors stumbled upon the bodies of the remaining 2 girls along a small path connecting Tent 8 in the shower area. They had been beaten to death and hidden inside their sleeping bags, placed where they wouldn't be immediately seen. The yearly Girl Scout camping trip came to an abrupt end. The camp's director wasted no time in organizing the evacuation, ushering the young campers back onto the buses while trying to prevent large groups from disturbing the crime scene. That same day, Camp Scott was shut down for good. It would never host another camping trip again. During the autopsy process, the medical examiner made a chilling discovery about the 3 young victims. Forensic analysis confirmed that the horrifying attack had occurred entirely inside Tent 8, where the unknown perpetrator had entered by unzipping the tent flaps. The vicious sexual assaults and beatings inflicted on the 3 girls left the interior drenched in blood. After the assault, the killer relocated the victims, along with their sleeping bags, placing them where Carla would later find their bodies. The tent, soaked in blood, became a crucial piece of physical evidence. The amount of blood made it unavoidable for the assailant to leave fingerprints or smudges. Despite indications that the attacker attempted to wipe away traces, the darkness of Camp Scott and the limited light from a flashlight made it nearly impossible to fully clean the scene. The day following the tragic murders, authorities carefully dismantled the wooden flooring of Tent 8 and transported it by air to a forensic laboratory for in-depth analysis. Among the bloodstains, investigators identified a nearly flawless footprint in blood, which matched a men's shoe size 9.5. Although law enforcement hoped to keep this discovery confidential, the information was leaked to the media, and soon everyone knew about the shoe print. Despite the perpetrator's efforts to clean up, he had left behind numerous clues. Most notably, the red flashlight he'd used to navigate the campsite was found lying on top of the victims. A fingerprint was also discovered on the flashlight's lens, but it was too smeared to be of use. The condition of the flashlight showed that the killer had come prepared. He had even placed bits of newspaper around the batteries to muffle the sound while moving. As the investigation widened across Camp Scott's 400-acre grounds, additional evidence was recovered, including a piece of rope and duct tape, likely used to tie up the girls. Investigators also came across a pair of discarded women's eyeglasses. As the investigation expanded, officers eventually discovered a small cave near the campsite. It quickly became apparent that someone had been living there in secret, evading detection by camp staff. Inside, police found several newspapers, some of which had the same print as the crumpled pages used to silence the flashlight batteries. This indicated that the killer had been camping out in the cave while planning his attack. Strangely, it also appeared as though the killer had anticipated that authorities would uncover his hideout. Scrawled on the cave wall in rough handwriting was a chilling message. The killer was here. Bye-bye, fools, along with the numbers 77-6-17, a date-style format often seen in correctional institutions. On June 15th, authorities announced that 2 specially trained tracking dogs, known as the Wonder Dogs, were being flown in from Pennsylvania to aid in the search for the murderer. Soon after arriving, the dogs guided their handlers to a pond on a nearby property. However, once the pond was drained, no additional evidence was uncovered. That very day, local rumors began spreading that a member of the Cherokee tribe had cursed the dogs. The strange rumor might have faded quickly if not for the unexpected death of one of the tracking dogs. The Rottweiler named Butts collapsed from heat exhaustion just a day after arriving. The second dog, Harris, continued working on the investigation, but despite his handler's public claim on June 19th that a breakthrough was near, no additional evidence was discovered. Then during his return trip to Pennsylvania, Harris, normally obedient and highly trained, escaped and ran straight into traffic. He was struck by a car and killed instantly. The bizarre sequence of events only fueled speculation that the dogs had been cursed. In less than 4 days, 2 elite canines, each worth over $10,000, had died unexpectedly, and the investigation was once again at a dead end. With no eyewitnesses able to identify the killer, detectives turned their focus to known offenders in the region with violent criminal histories. One individual immediately drew their attention: Gene Leroy Hart, a 33-year-old fugitive who had previously escaped from prison. Hart had been convicted of kidnapping and sexually assaulting 2 pregnant women. Although the crimes were severe, he was initially granted parole, but was later reincarcerated after being caught committing a burglary. In 1973, Gene successfully broke out of prison, and by 1977, he had become the primary suspect in the Camp Scott murders. A crucial clue possibly connecting him to the killings was the discovery of 2 photographs inside the cave believed to be the killer's hideout. Initially, officials incorrectly reported that the photos had been found near the victims' bodies, but in truth, the cave was situated roughly 2 miles from the actual crime scene. Forensic experts determined that both photographs had been developed by the same individual, during a time when Gene had been employed in the photo lab at Granite Reformatory. Despite limited physical evidence, authorities named Gene as a suspect, prompting immediate backlash from the public. Gene was a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, the largest federally recognized Cherokee tribe in the U.S., and many Native Americans believed he was being unfairly targeted due to racial bias and profiling. Still, law enforcement doubled down, initiating a major manhunt. On June 24th, hundreds of local volunteers formed a perimeter around a 4-mile stretch of land near Camp Scott. However, the search was soon undermined by issues. Some participants showed up intoxicated or high on marijuana, forcing police to arrest them before they could resume the operation. After 2 days with no success, the search effort was called off. For months, Gene seemed to have vanished without a trace. Despite the lack of sightings, investigators were convinced he hadn't left the Locust Grove area and suspected that relatives or acquaintances were helping him stay hidden. The search effort increasingly leaned on tips from the public. Then on April 6, 1978, nearly a year after the murders, a potentially valuable tip reached the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. Although past leads had often gone nowhere, agents cautiously followed up on this one. It led them to a dilapidated shack deep in the secluded Cookson Hills, over 40 miles, 65 kilometers, from Camp Scott. At 4:15 p.m., 8 officers raided the property. The remote shack turned out to belong to a local Cherokee medicine man. But more importantly, inside the dwelling was the very suspect authorities had spent nearly a year hunting. Gene was taken into custody on suspicion of involvement in the triple murder case. The local sheriff made headlines by boldly claiming he was 1,000% sure that Gene was responsible. What stood out to all 8 officers present at the arrest was that Gene was wearing a peculiar pair of women's eyeglasses at the time. This small detail echoed a disturbing pattern from Gene's prior offenses. In both earlier assaults, the victims clearly recalled that Gene had taken off their eyeglasses and tried them on himself. That connection gave new weight to one of the items found at Camp Scott, a pair of women's glasses left behind at the scene. Although public interest in the case had started to fade over the years, it surged again as the date of Gene's trial approached, reigniting Oklahoma's fascination with the horrific crime. Public attention around Gene's trial was deeply divided. One side believed he was undeniably guilty and deserved to be punished, while the other insisted he was a victim of police discrimination due to his race. Both camps followed the proceedings closely, though for completely opposite reasons. In 1979, nearly 2 years after the final trip to Camp Scott, the trial officially started. Outside the courthouse, Gene's supporters rallied in protest, many wearing shirts reading, "Stop the Mays County Railroad," implying that authorities were railroading Gene to cover their own failings. The media arrived in force, packing the courthouse's third floor, where the case was being heard. Gene's legal defense was led by Garvin A. Isaacs, a well-respected local lawyer and former public defender, hired using funds collected by Gene's supporters. During their first meeting, Gene looked Garvin in the eye and said, "I just want you to know, I didn't kill those Girl Scouts." For reasons he couldn't explain, Garvin found the statement sincere. Reflecting on it later, he recalled, "That was the very first thing he said to me, and I believed him." The prosecution relied heavily on what they believed to be compelling physical evidence connecting Gene to the murders. This included items discovered in the cave believed to be the killer's hideout, photographs traced back to Gene's former work in a prison photo lab, a man's shoe print found inside the tent, and biological materials such as hair and semen recovered at the scene. However, if the case had occurred in the present day, advancements in DNA technology could have definitively established Gene's presence or absence at the crime scene. Unfortunately, in 1979, DNA testing was still several years from being introduced, leaving prosecutors to build their case on circumstantial evidence alone. The sole elements that could have definitively tied Gene to the murders were either fingerprint evidence or reliable eyewitness accounts, but prosecutors had neither. The weak nature of the state's case essentially handed defense attorney Garvin Isaacs a ready-made defense. He argued to the jury that the male shoe print found at the scene didn't match Gene's foot size, and that the recovered hair samples weren't sufficient to link his client conclusively. The items discovered in the cave represented the most significant potential connection to Gene, yet even that was circumstantial. His criminal background and proximity to the camp appeared to be the main reasons he had become a suspect. But neither of those factors amounted to solid proof of guilt in such a brutal crime. The defense also pointed to another local criminal, William Stevens, as a possible suspect. Stevens, a convicted rapist, was mentioned as having been in the area at the time. One of the Girl Scouts who had witnessed an unknown man near the campsite testified that when she shone her flashlight on him, he briefly glanced at her and walked away, but she couldn't clearly identify his face. Additionally, a friend of Stevens, Joyce Payne, testified that he had borrowed her flashlight for a fishing trip shortly before the murders, but never returned it. When shown a photo of the red flashlight found near the bodies, Joyce identified it, saying, "That's my flashlight. It was given to me by my son." Larry Payne, Joyce's son, testified that he had seen William Stevens shortly after the murders, noticing that Stevens had fresh claw marks on his arms and neck. His boots appeared to be stained with what looked like blood, and Stevens had asked to use Larry's bathroom to clean them. However, William's employer later confirmed that he had been working in Florida at the time of the killings. Afterward, Larry retracted his statement. William Stevens passed away in 1984, leaving the question of his involvement unresolved. Like other violent criminals in the area, Stevens had been a suspect at one point. However, after extensive questioning, investigators were convinced he was not the perpetrator and cleared him of suspicion. The defense argued that this decision had been made only because local authorities were eager to pin the crime on Gene. On March 20th, 1979, Gene Leroy Hart was officially found not guilty by the jury, who unanimously concluded that he was not responsible for the murders. The verdict shocked many in the local community who had followed the case, as they were certain of Gene's guilt. For those who had supported Gene, still protesting outside the courthouse, the result felt like a victory. Meanwhile, the families of the 3 murdered Girl Scouts were devastated by the outcome. To provide some comfort, prosecutors reminded the families that despite the acquittal, Gene would still return to prison. He had numerous convictions, including multiple burglary charges, kidnapping and rape charges from an earlier arrest, and additional charges related to his escape from prison. He was sent back to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, where he had only served 3 years of his 308-year sentence before escaping. Not long after returning to the penitentiary, Gene collapsed while jogging in the prison's exercise yard. At the age of 35, he suffered a severe heart attack and passed away. Following his acquittal, the investigation seemed to slow down and eventually came to a halt. From the outset of the case, local authorities had been confident they had identified the killer. However, as time went on, the public began to question whether the sheriffs had been so focused on Gene that they had overlooked the real murderer, allowing him to escape justice. A breakthrough in the case occurred a decade after the trial, when advances in technology allowed for the testing of DNA samples. In 1989, DNA testing was conducted on the semen found in the victims' bodies. 3 out of the 5 samples matched Gene Leroy Hart's DNA. However, this wasn't definitive proof of his guilt, as the other 2 samples yielded inconclusive results. Forensic experts calculated that statistically, about 1 in 7,700 DNA samples from Native Americans could match Gene's DNA. This suggested a high probability likelihood that Gene was the perpetrator, but it wasn't conclusive enough to definitively solve the case. The hunt for the killer of the Oklahoma Girl Scouts went on, and in 2008, additional DNA tests were performed. Forensic experts took samples from stains found on a pillowcase in Tent 8. However, by this time, 30 years had passed since the crime, and the DNA had degraded too much to be used for profiling. Another decade passed, with DNA technology continuing to evolve rapidly, while the rest of the world had moved on from the tragic murders of the 3 Girl Scouts. Mays County remained obsessed with finding answers. Mike Reed, the newly appointed sheriff of Mays County, had grown up in the area, and when the murders of the Girl Scouts occurred, he was around the same age as the victims. Like everyone else in the community, he was well aware of the case. It had left families across the state fearful. If children weren't safe at a scout camp, where could they be safe? Now, as an adult and the sheriff, Mike was asked to revisit the case that had both terrified and captivated him as a child. A year later, he took the case to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, the largest child protection organization in the U.S. The NCMEC's cold case team, composed of 23 top experts, including FBI profilers, behavioral analysts, and seasoned homicide detectives, began reviewing the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. The cold case team thoroughly reviewed all aspects of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders, including physical and circumstantial evidence, the timeline of events, autopsy findings, the limited DNA evidence, and everything law enforcement had uncovered about Gene Leroy Hart. After a month of deliberation, the team reached a unanimous conclusion. All 23 experts were certain that Gene Leroy Hart was the murderer. Following this determination, the NCMEC recommended conducting further DNA testing, but this would come at a significant cost of over $30,000. Unfortunately, neither the victims' families nor the Mays County Sheriff's Office had the funds for such an expensive test. However, other individuals passionate about the case rallied together, launching a public fundraising campaign in 2017 to raise the necessary $30,000 for the next round of DNA analysis. The findings of these DNA tests have not been publicly released, but in 2022, investigators disclosed that since 2019, they had been in possession of DNA evidence that strongly indicated Gene Leroy Hart's involvement in the murders. The evidence was so compelling that it excluded all other potential suspects, leaving Gene as the only person who could possibly be the killer. However, the sheriff's office stated that they would not make these DNA results public unless the families of the 3 victims specifically requested it. Mike Reed, the sheriff of Mays County, made a statement saying, "Unless something new emerges, something that we're not aware of, I'm firmly convinced of Hart's guilt and his involvement in this case." In 2022, Hulu aired a docuseries titled Keeper of the Ashes: The Oklahoma Girl Scout Murders, hosted by Kristen Chenoweth, the girl who had been meant to be the 4th camper in Tent 8 that night. Kristen, now a successful actress and singer, couldn't shake the haunting what-ifs. She never thought she would have been the sole survivor of Tent 8, but if she hadn't been sick and unable to attend, she believed she would have met the same tragic fate as Lori, Michele, and Doris. At one point during the docuseries, Kristen reflects on the tragic events, saying, "This happened. There's no closure. There's no neat, tidy ending. And for the families still grieving the loss of the 3 young girls, that statement rings true. For the victims' families, the DNA findings that were kept confidential provided a sense of closure, offering reassurance that the man likely responsible for killing those girls was gone for good. However, officially, Gene Leroy Hart has never been confirmed as the murderer. There are also lingering questions that suggest the involvement of a second perpetrator. These include the bloodstained shoe print, which was 2 sizes smaller than Gene's, and the testimonies regarding who had been in possession of the red flashlight. Additionally, during the trial, a blood spatter expert testified that more than one weapon had likely been used, suggesting that the assailant was ambidextrous or used both hands. Could Gene have subdued all 3 girls without any of them escaping? It's possible, but it would have been much easier with 2 people. While Gene is no longer alive, is it possible that a second killer has never been caught? This is something we may never know, and technically, the case of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders remains unsolved. Although many were convinced of his guilt, many also felt that the investigation was too rushed, and perhaps not all the facts were properly considered. The emergence of new evidence, such as bloodstains, shoe prints, and testimonies suggesting the presence of a second perpetrator, only complicates the picture. This raises an important question. How many investigations in history can we truly call resolved?